Ah, Shalom, Part 2, Chapter 1, titled Salem's Story. This is the story of Salem, as I heard it from Melchizedek's lips on the occasion of Sukkot's party, 15 days after the release of Lot and his daughters. It all started with a dream in the heart of a man named Adoniah. He possessed many riches, but he appreciated nothing more than the justice and peace that were born of wisdom and love. Tired of the injustices that prevailed throughout the land of Canaan, Adoniah decided to build a kingdom that was governed by laws of justice and love. Love and justice, my fault. The name of the capital of that kingdom would be Salem, the city of peace. Salem's subjects would not wield bows and arrows, but would be trained in musical art. Each inhabitant of Salem would always have at his fingertips a musical instrument to express through him the peace and joy of that new kingdom. Together they would form a powerful orchestra in the fight against disharmony, born of pride and selfishness. The first step of Adonias for the concretization of his plan was to elaborate the laws of the new kingdom, which he wrote them in a parchment. Salem's subjects could not lie, steal, hate, or kill their fellow man. Pride and selfishness were indicated as a cause of all evil. Therefore, they could not exist in that place of peace. The laws of parchment required the practice of humility, sincerity, friendship, and above all, the love that is the greatest of all virtues. After registering on the parchment the laws that would govern the kingdom, Adoniah began to plan the architecture of Salem. It would be a city at first small, with rooms for 1,200 people. As the place of its construction, a high region of Canaan, west of the Mount of Olives, was chosen. In a short time, the realization of Adoniah began to attract people from all over the world who, from far and near, came to know the palaces and mansions that were being built. Admired by the beauty of that white city, visitors asked about who their inhabitants would be. Adoniah showed them the scroll, saying that Salem was destined for the clean of heart, those who were willing to obey his laws. Chapter 2. The building of the city was finally completed, and Salem proved beautiful as an ornate bride, waiting for her husband. Seated on his throne, Adoniah examined the numerous candidates for subjects who came from everywhere. Those who, promising fidelity to the laws, were approved, received 3 gifts from the king: the right to a mansion, fine linen garments, and a musical instrument in which they should practice. The city was finally full of inhabitants. Full of joy, Adoniah summoned everyone to Salem's inauguration party, during which he proclaimed a decree that would determine the future of the kingdom, saying, "From this day, which is the 10th of the 7th month, 6 years will be counted, in which all the inhabitants will be tested. Only those who remain loyal, progressing in the practice of the laws of parchment, will be confirmed as heirs of this kingdom of peace. Those who are bound by guilt and transgression will be banished by trial." The king's words led everyone to a thorough examination of the heart, and they rejoiced with the certainty that they would achieve victory over all pride and selfishness, which are the roots of all evil. Adoniah had an only child whom he had given the name of Melchizedek. The beauty, tenderness, and wisdom of that beloved son had been his inspiration for the edification and foundation of his kingdom. Melchizedek was 12 years old when Salem was inaugurated. It was the plan of Adonias to crown him king over the approved subjects at the end of the 6 years. This plan would keep it a secret until the right time. The prince, with his virtues and sympathy, soon became very dear to everyone in Salem. He had he always had a smile and a word of affection on his lips. He appreciated being with the subjects in their homes, reciting the laws of the parchment in the form of beautiful songs that he lived composing. Its presence brought to the environment an atmosphere of happiness and peace. That beloved prince possessed, in fact, all the virtues necessary to be king of a victorious Salem. Adoniah had built a special mansion next to the palace, with the purpose of offering it to the subject whose life most perfectly expressed the laws of the parchment. Daily he watched the inhabitants, searching among them for that person who he wished to honor. He was walking through Salem's malls when, through the chirping of a bird, Adoniah heard a similar voice to that of his son. Turning to see who he was, he found a beautiful young man singing a song. When he contemplated on his face the brightness of wisdom and purity, Adoniah was glad to have found him who he could honor. The young man, who was a faithful copy of the prince, was called Samael. Placing a ring on his finger, the king led him to the palace, where he was received by Melchizedek, who offered many presents, including the right to always be by his side. Adoniah prepared a great banquet in honor of Samael, for which all were invited. When he looked at him next to the king, the subjects cheered him with joy, crediting him as being the prince himself. They exalted with joy the virtues of that beautiful young man. When Melchizedek manifested himself, placing himself with a smile right next to the right of his father. At the banquet, Samael was honored by all. He was really worthy of residing in the mansion of the mountain, for there was in him a perfect reflection of the virtues that crowned the beloved prince. Chapter 3. Salem grew in happiness and peace. With joy, the subjects gathered every day at dawn to hear, sing, and play the sublime compositions of Melchizedek, which inspired acts of kindness and peace. Among friendships born and strengthened by virtue of harmonious music, the one that united the prince and Samael stood out. Since he had begun to reside in the mountain mansion, Samael had become his constant companion. Together they spent long hours meditating on the laws of parchment. With admiration, the honest subject saw Adoniah's son transform those laws into beautiful songs. The sweet melodies were born from his lips like the perfume of a flower. Aware of the importance of music in the preservation of harmony and peace in Salem, the prince, in addition to singing, began to devote himself to instrumental music, the lute being his favorite instrument. It was through the instrument that he was able to express with greater perfection the richness of his soul. Of the 6 years of testing, 5 finally passed. Adoniah, happy to see that until then all the inhabitants of Salem had remained loyal to the principles contained in the parchment, summoned them to a banquet in which he would make important revelations. Having taken their places before the throne, the subjects joyfully joined their voices, singing the songs of peace, being ruled by Samael. After hearing them, the king, excited, addressed his son, hugging him in the midst of applause from the grateful crowd. Everyone recognized that peace and joy in Salem were largely due to the love and dedication of the beloved prince, who was the author of these sweet songs. At that moment of recognition and gratitude, Adoniah revealed his plans kept kept until then secret. In a leisurely voice he told them, "Subjects of this kingdom of peace, my soul is full of joy to contemplate on your day your faces more radiant than in times past. Your clothes remain white and pure, as when you received them from my hands. The harmony of your voices and instruments are better today." Having said these words, the king added solemnly, "A year of trial still remains, at the end of which you will be examined. Remaining faithful as here, you will be honored by being confirmed as subjects of this kingdom of peace. However, if someone were found at fault, they will be banished, even if this trial brings us much sadness and suffering." The king's words led the subjects to a deep reflection. Everyone, examining himself, inquired reverently, "Will we be approved?" Surely they would be victorious because they love Salem and his laws, joined the voices in an expressive song of faithfulness. At the end of the song, Adoniah revealed his great secret. Those who are approved, inheriting this kingdom of peace, will receive my son as king, to whom I will give the glorified throne of this Salem Victoriosa. The revelation of the king was acclaimed by all with much joy. Adoniah, however, had not yet revealed all of his plan, so asking for silence, he continued, "My son will hold a special scepter, in which I will seal all the right of dominion. His scepter, symbolizing all harmony, will be a lute." Before this revelation that sensitized everyone, the prince, prostrating himself at the feet of his father, cried, motivated by much joy. Meanwhile, everyone applauded him with euphoria, yearning to see the dawn of the day when peace would be victorious. Adoniah, calling Samael to be with his son, concluded by saying, "In the government of this victorious Salem, I have the purpose of making Samael the first after Melchizedek. The parchment of the laws will be entrusted to him, and he must be the guardian of the honor of this triumphant kingdom." Samael, knowing Adoniah's plan for Salem's future, was filled with euphoria. He was now gazing at that city like no other, imagining his future of glory. Considering the king's words that he would be the second in the kingdom, he let himself be dominated by a feeling of exaltation. He, who until then, in obedience to the laws of parchment, had lived a life of humility, began to take pride in his position. In his winding, he felt by the throne, having Salem's subjects at his feet, praising his greatness with praise. He let himself be dominated by a feeling of exaltation. He who until then, in obedience of the laws of parchment, had lived a life of humility, began to take pride in his position. In his winding, he felt by the throne, having Salem's subjects at his feet, praising his greatness with praise. Samael, totally dominated by that feeling, did not realize that he was being driven along a dangerous road. The pride that seduced him was generating a selfishness that would later manifest in greed. A week after the revelation of Adoniah, the subjects promoted a party in homage to Melchizedek, the future king of Salem. Seeing him acclaimed for so many praises, Samael had his heart snatched away by a strange feeling of envy, the result of pride and selfishness. He could not bear the thought of being left in the background. Wasn't he as beautiful and wise as the prince? It was almost impossible to disguise such a feeling of unhappiness. In times past, Samael found indescribable pleasure in the moments when, beside the prince, he recited the laws contained in the parchment, which were transformed into beautiful songs. Now such moments became unpleasant, for those principles contradicted their ideals. He decided, however, not to reveal his feelings of rebellion. He would support the old fashioned parchment until, with his authority, he could exclude it from the new kingdom that would be established. Wouldn't he be the guardian of those laws? That victory would seem to achieve through its influence and wisdom. Judging to be able to influence the son of Adoniah with his dreams of success, Samael approached him with euphoria and began to speak to him of the glories of the coming kingdom, where the two, covered with honors, would enjoy the praises of a victorious Salem. They would be the heroes of the most perfect kingdom established among men. The delirious words of the honest subject brought concern and sadness to the young prince's heart, for they did not reflect the teachings of love and humility of the parchment. Seeing his intimate friend in danger, Melchizedek, with a tenderness never revealed, led him to the side of the throne, where, taking the scroll, he began to read compassionately the following paragraphs. Salem's kingdom will be affirmed on humility, for this virtue is the basis of all true greatness. Humility is the fruit of love, being contrary to pride, which can keep a creature caught in dust, making it content with its limitations, deceiving it as if they were of infinite value. Humility consists in forgetting oneself, and this in a life of selfless service for others. Samael, struggling to cover up his indignation at the reading of the scroll that was outdated for him, said to the prince, in a friend's advice, "My good friend, we will reign in a victorious Salem, which will shine well above this scroll, whose principles were faithfully fulfilled in the years of trial. Is not full freedom not the glory of Salem? Well, know that complete freedom will not coexist with these laws, whose objective is locked at the end of the 5 years. It is up to us to crown Salem with the honor of total freedom, which will generate endless happiness. Such freedom is impossible to exist under the limitations of the scroll." The king's son shuddered a lot at his friend's words, which showed insanity. How to free him of that path of death? No one in Salem, besides Melchizedek, knew Samael's sad condition. With patience, the prince tried to make him aware of the real value of the parchment, whose laws could never be altered, as this would bring about the end of all peace. The prince's advice finally awakened his heart. Meditating on his words, he became aware of following a deceptive path. Seeing in the eyes of the one who loved the tears of repentance so much, the son of Adoniah rejoiced in his victory over pride and selfishness. The days that followed the liberation were full of accomplishments. The prince was even more friendly, willing to give all of himself so that his companion could continue triumphantly on the path of humility. In those days of jubilation, he has given the honor of knowing the scepter that was being molded. In a moment of carelessness, Samael, who once again enjoyed peace in the spirit, allowed his heart to be possessed again by a feeling of greatness, which triggered a new storm in his soul. That feeling mixed with pride and greed came upon him when the prince showed him the golden loop, on which the seal of the entire domain was being printed. Chapter 5. From his mansion, Samael watched Salem in the morning glow. Seeing her rich ornate bride waiting for her king, she coveted her. In his delirium, he began to formulate plans of conquest. He could already feel exalted on his throne, holding the precious scepter in his hands. Everyone would praise him as the liberator of the oppression of those laws. Salem will be a kingdom of complete freedom and pleasure. Dominated by this greed, he began to conquer plans of conquest. Samael decided to act subtly among the subjects, leading them to see on the parchment some inaccuracy to real freedom. In his deception mission, he would act with apparent goodness, showing interest in the growth of everyone's happiness. Putting his plans into practice, he began to visit the subjects in their mansions, telling them about the glories of the coming kingdom, where they would enjoy complete freedom. Great was his influence on Salem. Everyone admired his beauty and wisdom, having him as a perfect apostle of justice and love. No one could imagine that in the midst of that atmosphere of joy and gratitude, a subtle trap was being placed, in the grip of which many could fall carelessly. In his seductive mission, Samael did not speak against the parchment. However, he praised him for having exercised a trial mission in those 6 years ready to end. In his logic, however, he tried to show that in the coming kingdom, when all were approved, they would be above those laws. His arguments, apparently correct, paved the way for him to openly affirm that in the new kingdom the existence of parchment would be an obstacle to the realization of true freedom. The seeds of rebellion thrown by Samuel would soon germinate in the hearts of many in Salem. This happened 6 months after Yom Kippur, when everyone's destiny would be sealed. A third of the inhabitants, seduced by the terrible deception, now exalted him, in complete disregard of the laws and the prince, whom they judged as outdated. Adoniah, who suffered when he saw the rise of all this rebellion, summoned the subjects to an emergency meeting. On the face of all you could see the contrasting provisions. In a compassionate voice, the king began to reveal to them, as he had never done before, the great importance of the laws recorded on the parchment, showing that they were the basis of all prosperity and peace. If such laws were excluded, all happiness and glory would be extinguished, leading to chaos. After showing the need for the laws, Melchizedek, moved by a strong desire to save those he loved so much, lifted the scroll in front of everyone, and in a voice full of goodness offered them forgiveness and the opportunity to start again on the path of peace. His words moved everyone, making even Samael himself motivated at first. However, pride prevented him from repentance again. In this way, the honest subject, when he could still look regretfully towards the scroll, hardened in his rebellion, deciding to continue until the end. This decision, however, would not manifest it promptly, for he had idealized a treacherous plan. At the end of the opportunity meeting, Samael summoned his followers to a secret meeting, which he held under the blanket of the night, next to the Cedron Creek that was outside the walls of Salem. After cursing the parchment and all those who defended it, he began telling them about his plans for revenge and betrayal. As you know, the 6 years of trial are running out, subtracting, as of today, 24 weeks for the day of the coronation. If you would like to have me as king instead of Melchizedek, I can steal your scepter, taking over the kingdom. Samael began to explain to them the betrayal launches, giving them the proper guidance on how to act from that date. We need to maintain an appearance of fidelity to the parchment and the prince until it is time to act. The blow will be given on the night before the coronation day. At midnight, we sneak away from Salem. I will steal the scepter that night, and together we will flee to the deep valley where the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah are. There we will arm ourselves and march against Salem, subjugating our enemies. We will end then with the Pergamino and with all those who refuse to pay obedience to our government. Chapter 6. Days of apparent tranquility and peace ensued. Samael, feigning fidelity, was always at the side of the prince, showing admiration for his new compositions that exalted the laws of parchment. Samael's followers, in the same way, united the voices in praise that expressed the greatness of the principles to which they discussed it. Melchizedek, full of joy to see the day of his coronation approaching, rehearsed with the subjects the songs of victory, which he had composed especially for that occasion. He happily talked to everyone about his dreams of making Salem increasingly full of honor for his beauty and harmony. Samael, in his hidden wickedness, mocked the prince. He already foresaw the pain that would be caused by the betrayal. In those days of apparent peace, the rebel subjects sought to know where the scepter would be hidden until the day of the coronation. The prince, without distrust, revealed all the secret: the room, the chest with its enigma, the rich case, and finally the treasure. Contemplating the cunning of Samael was encouraged to see the seal of the domain printed on its convex part. He understood that he who possessed it would have Salem's kingdom in his hands. Only a few days, he thought, and he would have that precious instrument under his power. The sun declined, bringing Salem the day that would mean victory or defeat. Shortly before nightfall, Samael had left the palace where he had spent the whole day next to the prince, helping him in the preparations for the coronation ceremony. Heading toward his mansion, he greeted the darkness with an evil smile. how much he had longed for that night, while the faithful, bewitched by the excitement of the happy victory, reviewed under the lights of candlesticks the ornaments of their instruments, their garments and mansions, certifying that they would be approved the next morning. Samael and his followers made their final preparations to wield the blow. At midnight, following Samael's instructions, all his followers silently abandoned their mansions, heading for the deep valley of Sidron, where they would wait for their new king. Samael, in turn, went to the palace funds, where he hoped to enter without being noticed, going to meet the scepter. Avoiding making any noise, he crossed the portal, silently heading to the room that guarded the beautiful scepter. At that moment, the prince, who sleeplessly rolled in his bed, feeling some danger, went to his father's room and woke him up, saying, "Father, I heard the sound of footsteps inside the palace." Stroking the head of his son, Adoniah, sleepy, replied, "Son, don't worry. Lie with me and sleep peacefully. From here the dawn will scratch, and you will have your golden lute in your hands." The prince, reassured by the reliable words of his father, gave himself to a dream of beautiful dreams, in which he lived next to Samael and all Salem's subjects, the festive moments of the coronation. While this was happening, the rebel with trembling hands seized the scepter. At that time, he had the idea of attacking only with the lute, leaving the case in its proper place, taking only the lute, leaving the case in its proper place. With a smile full of evil, he imagined the moment when the king would give his son that empty case. Taking the scepter with him, Samael hurried to the place where his followers were waiting for him. When he found them, he gave way to all his pride by proclaiming, "Now I am the king of Salem, who owns a scepter like mine. With it I dominate the land and the sea. My strength is in darkness, because through them I conquered it." Celebrating the victory, the noisy mob separated to distance themselves from Salem, following the corrupted cities of the plain, where they pretended to arm themselves for the conquest of their kingdom. The sun appeared on the horizon, bringing the light of the Day of Atonement, Yom Kippur. Waking up from his dream of beautiful dreams, the prince got ready for the ceremony of judgment and coronation. Special garments of fine linen, adorned with gold threads and precious stones, were prepared. After dressing, Melchizedek headed to meet his subjects at the southern end of Salem. From there, he would lead them on a festive march toward the palace to the north at Mount Zion. Adoniah, sounding a long horn, summoned everyone to the trial meeting. Leaving their mansions, all the remaining ones went toward the square of the south door, taking with them their musical instruments. When he met those faithful, Melchizedek was surprised by the absence of many. That mystery hurt in his soul, for he hid the most beloved face of his friend Samuel. Leaving his followers together, the prince went in search of the absent. In his unsuccessful search, he went to the mansion on the mountain, where he called Samael. His voice, however, brought no reply beyond an empty echo, which translated ingratitude. Reading betrayal in the sad emptiness, he felt like crying. In a single moment, the whole past came to mind of the one whom he had sought with such dedication to keep it in his glory through wise advice. He remembered those days that followed his recovery, how he had rejoiced with the certainty of that his friend would never fall again. Taking him to present Taking him to present the tragedy, Samael's inquiry about the lute came to mind, which he showed in a gesture of friendship. The memory of this fact, added to the steps heard inside the palace that night, gave him certainty that Salem was in danger. Not enduring that possibility of betrayal, he prostrated himself in tears, hurt by the terrible ingratitude of the one to whom he had dedicated so much love. Curved in pain, he remained for some time trying to find comfort. He finally dried his tears, determined to make any sacrifice in order to return his glory and power to Salem, redeeming the scepter from the hands of the rebellion. Consoled by the certainty of victory, Melchizedek returned to the side of the faithful subjects, hiding their suffering as well as the reasons for the absence of many. The prince guided them in a triumphant march toward the palace. Chapter 7. As they approached Mount Zion, they climbed the very white steps of the stairs, being followed by the triumphant crowd. It hurt in his soul the expectation of seeing his cheerful song die on the lips of the faithful, that morning due to the betrayal. He was now inside the palace before the magnificent throne that awaited the young king. At the base of the throne, the parchment of the laws lay open. In the middle of the floral arrangement, next to him you could see the beautiful crown, made of gold and precious stones, as well as the case of the scepter that symbolized all the harmony of Salem. The subjects were happy, for they knew they would be found worthy to inherit the kingdom of peace. They were waiting for the moment of the coronation, when their new king would rule them from his throne with his precious scepter in a triumphant chant. Amid the applause of the victorious hosts, Melchizedek turned to his father, who received him with a warm hug. The moment was truly solemn. The hosts were silenced in anticipation of the coronation. The case will be opened and everyone would witness the exaltation of the beloved prince. With his heart pounding with joy, Adoniah bent down to the case, opening it carefully. When finding it empty, the joy of his countenance gave rise to an expression of inexpressible concern and sadness. For in that scepter the fate of the kingdom of peace had been sealed. Seeing his father and all the subjects afflicted by the absence of the scepter, and so many friends who should be with them at that time, Melchizedek comforted them with the promise that he would seek the scepter. Unaware of the risks and dangers that awaited the prince on his way, the subjects said goodbye to him, watching him leave in haste. At the dawn of that day, which would be the day of his coronation, reached the distant rebels of Salem, en route to the cities of the plain. On that morning Samael was filled with the fury when he saw that the precious loot was adorned with inscriptions of the laws contained in the scroll. Taking a pointed stone, he began to damage the scepter, scraping away all the words of love and justice. His harmonious strings were now in tune over his wounded convex part, but he was still beautiful, for Salem's domain lay sealed on him. Owning it meant being the owner of all power. When he reached the height where the road branched, Samael ordered his followers to continue towards Gomorrah, while he would go to Sodom, where he would remain for 2 days, joining them later. He waited for the night to enter Sodom. When he entered there, he walked through the narrow streets without being noticed, until he found an isolated house on an elevation. Making the scepter his weapon, he invaded the house, killing his inhabitants while they slept. He thus took possession of that residence where alone he would machine his plans for the sale of Salem. The evening of that day, which would be the coronation, reached the son of Adoniah. As he walked along the stony path to the valley, his eyes full of sadness and anxiety turned to the ground, looking for the traces of the rebels. The memory of the ingratitude of those whom he loved so much made him cry. His tears, reflecting the last flashes of the setting sun, resembled drops of blood flowing from a wounded heart. He cried not because of the dangers that came upon him on that cold night, but because of the unhappy fate of those who changed Salem's peace because of the violence of those cities in the plain. His only consolation was the memory of those who, despite all the temptations, had remained faithful. They had been promised to return the scepter, and this would be achieved despite any sacrifice. After a long night of insomnia, when the prince was lying on the side of the road, he streaked the light of a day that would be decisive. As he approached Sodom on that coming morning, the thought of being so close to the scepter of his beloved Salem made him forget all the fatigue, shortening his steps toward the challenge. When the great gate of the city opened, a fear came upon him upon hearing frightful noises of disharmony, which translated the pride, selfishness, and greed that dominated all hearts, making them explode in the orgy of an endless evil. It would be a great risk to expose yourself to the free violence of that city. This thought made him pause at a step from the portal, where he shuddered, bowed his forehead in an inexpressible internal struggle. He was tempted to retreat, but struggled with all his soul forces against the thought of failure. Thinking of Salem's sad fate, whose dominion was being trampled inside that cruel Sodom, Melchizedek made a firm decision. As a reckless warrior, he would he would have to move forward, and certainly, even if he had to face the accumulation of all the dangers, he would continue until he raised in his victorious hands the beloved scepter. Resolute and hopeful, he went through Sodom's door, divining into that strange world, diving into that strange world. Everything there was the opposite of Salem, beginning with the rough and dirty stones of his constructions. Sodom was a kingdom of darkness. The contrasting presence of the prince was soon noticed by many who, in tumult, surrounded him. The purity of the character expressed in his great face and the splendor of his garments filled them with horror, and they retreated as defeated by an invisible force. Dominated by fury, they began to chase him from a distance, determined to make him flee. He was throwing stones and mud trying to stain his clothes, but they did not hit him. Meanwhile, he advanced in his anxious search. They finally gave up chasing him at sunset. Chapter 8. The son of Adoniah traveled all the streets and alleys in search of this beautiful scepter, but it was in vain. Seeing the sun decline on the horizon, announcing the arrival of a dark and cold night, his heart was in great agony. There, in that last alley, almost defeated by his exhaustion and despair, he bowed his forehead, fainting in tears. His lips pronounced in the middle of sobs the following words: Salem, Salem, you can't perish. Your scepter needs to be redeemed from the grip of rebellion. But when and where will I find it? There are no more forces left in me, and the hope of redeeming him before night leaves me. The prince, in his supreme anguish, did not perceive that another groan of pain, coming from the busted strings of a humiliated lute, was heard in that evening. Suddenly the weak groan penetrated his ears, reviving with him the certainty that the great moment of redemption had come. Drying her tears, she gathered the last forces running in the direction of a small house on a hill, where the sound seemed to come from. As he went to the door between the open, he stopped when he contemplated a contrasting scene of humiliating slavery. Samael, wrapped in a dirty cloak, punished Salem's scepter. Both the young man and the scepter were so disfigured that there was almost no feature of the lost glory in them. That scepter, however, certainly raised as it was very valuable, for in it lay the seal of Salem's dominion. The contemplation of the one who had been his best friend and of that idealized scepter as a symbol of all harmony in such a tragic condition deeply moved the prince, making him cry loudly. Only until then did the rebel subject perceive his unwanted presence. Shivering, he got up and, full of anger, asked him, "What brought you to Sodom?" Indicating towards the damaged scepter, Melchizedek exclaimed, "Salem's glory is destroyed." With a laugh, Samael mocked his sadness, saying, "Now I am the king of Salem. You who are faithful to the parchment will become my slaves." Without giving importance to Samael's word of affront, the prince, moved by infinite anguish, said, "Salem, Salem is hurt by your betrayal. Why did you change your home of justice and love for this valley of injustice, hate, and death? Now, if you do not wish to return to Salem, return the scepter. It was to redeem it that, belittling all the dangers, I descended into this hostile valley." Knowing the prince's purpose, the rebel was filled with rage, and clenching his fist, he said, "I hate you, Melchizedek. Having said this, he threw the scepter to the ground and, stomping on it, added, I have the desire to do the same with you. In front of that affront, the prince felt no fear, but compassion. Transporting himself to the happy past, he remembered the happy moments in which he always had Samuel by his side. He was a pure and humble young man of heart. Why had he allowed himself to be enslaved by the illusion of pride and selfishness? How painful it was to see the young man who, for his beauty and sympathy, had been honored above all subjects, now ruined by greed. Had it not been the prince's dream to have beside his glorified throne the one he considered the most precious friend? This tragedy hurt his soul. However, the sad condition of his scepter afflicted him even more, for this had been made as a symbol of all harmony, and was being destroyed under the feet of ingratitude. Surprised not to see in Melchizedek's eyes an expression of fear but of mercy, Samael felt frustrated in his insults that aimed to intimidate him, leading him to give up his mission. Before the dignified position of the prince, who contemplated him in silent pain, he felt ashamed. That weakness, however, was banished by the pride that dominated his heart. He began to plan something terrible, to humiliate and hurt the prince, make him suffer even more. With derision, he said, Salem's scepter may be yours if you manage to pay me the price of your ransom. With a gleam in his eyes, the prince asked him, What is the price? Salem with the Samael, with a mischievous smile, slowly replied, The price is not gold or silver, but pain and blood. You must undress completely of your clothes lying on the floor. You must endure in that condition blows until the sun sets. If you are willing to submit to me without reacting, the scepter will be entirely yours. Shivering at such a cruel proposal, the son of Adoniah looked toward the sun that lay distant on a cloud. He then began to lock an intense fight in his heart. At first, the horror of the sacrifice almost dominated him, encouraging him to retire. But the thought of seeing Salem enslaved by rebellion finally led him to the decision to pay the ransom price, surrendering himself to humiliating suffering. Having made the firm decision to rescue the scepter, the prince threw the clothes, placing them on a stone. He lay down immediately on that cold floor, his forehead turned toward the west. Mercilessly, Samael began to scourge him, using the scepter itself as an instrument of torture. Moaning at the pain of the blows that made him bleed, the prince kept his eyes fixed on the sun that seemed to stop over the cloud. Stunned by the pain, he finally watched the sun set. The sun soon set. Encouraged by the approaching victory, he muttered in a low voice, Jerusalem, Salem, from here I will have in your arms a precious scepter that, in my hands, will become an instrument of justice and peace. Hearing the promise the prince made between groans, Samael shouted at him furiously, Your suffering will not bring any dawn to Salem, for your hands will never be able to touch in the scepter. After making that affront, Samael took possession of a pointed stone, preparing to deal the last blows. While thinking of Salem's happy victory, Melchizedek felt his right arm being compressed by Samuel's feet. Following this rude gesture, a blow that made him contort in agony, his hand had been cruelly dug, beginning to pour abundant blood from the open wound. The same violence was later unloaded on his left hand. Not enduring the agony caused by those heart-breaking blows, the son of Adoniah, bloodied, plunged into the darkness of a deep fainting. Chapter 9. When he stopped beating the prince, the rebel subject was possessed by a strange horror when he contemplated on the face of the one who had only done him good the drowsiness of death. He tried not to remember the past, but irresistibly he felt himself being dragged into the days of his happy innocence in Salem. Clothed in rich robes, he was always next to the prince who, with dedication, taught him his songs every day about peace. In the unwanted memories by which he was dragged, he revived his first steps on the path of pride and selfishness. He remembered the incessant advice and pleas of the one who had been his best friend, to give up that path that could lead him to unhappiness. After being dragged in memories by all the past of unhappiness destroyed by his fault, Samael was aware of his ingratitude. Horrified by what he has done, by what he had done, he leaned over Melchizedek's bloody body, and despaired when he saw him lifeless. Not bearing the burden of great guilt, he left that place hurriedly, wishing to hide away under the darkness of the cold night. After a deep fainting, the prince began to revive consciousness. In delusions that transported him to the heart of his beloved Salem, he relived and lived in dream moments. With joy he contemplated the face of his best friend, to whom he extended his hand with a smile. But his gesture was frustrated by a deep pain. Amid the applause of the victorious subjects, he received the scepter from his father, but when he touched it, he felt an irresistible pain in his hands. With these dreams, frustrated by pain, Melchizedek awoke to reality. He was naked, hurt, and lonely in a dangerous place, away from Salem's coat and affection. More painful was to think that all that had been the retribution of someone who had been the main target of all the gifts of his love. The prince, unable to move, considering with great betrayal, began to cry without comfort. He regretted not for his pain, not for the downfall of those, but for the downfall of those who had changed Salem's love and justice for contempt and hatred that would finally reduce them to ashes over that damned valley. Through the tears, the prince watched the sky that, like a cloak inked with blood, stretched in the light of the setting sun. He remembered then the loot which he had paid the high price, such a high price. Where would he be? In his desperate escape, Samuel had left the scepter abandoned next to Melchizedek's wounded body. When he saw it, he forgot all the pain. He hugged him with his wounded hand, stroking the ruined convex parts with a smile. He said, "You are mine again. I bought you with my blood." Amen. Samuel, who, dominated by the strange horror, had fled after committing the horrible crime, stopped a step away from Sodom's door. There, driven by pride, he repented with indignation at his weakness. Why had he fled after winning such a great victory? Wasn't his plan to destroy the king of Salem, to establish his own kingdom? Remembering the scepter, he decided to return to take it. Why had he left him abandoned next to the corpse of that hated prince? Gathering his new forces, Melchizedek went dumbfounded to the palace where he had left his clothes. After dressing, having the beloved scepter by his chest, the son of Adoniah, with deep emotion, made an oath before leaving the place of his suffering. Stroking the scepter, he said, "My beloved scepter, you were created as an emblem of harmony that comes from justice and love. All the glory of Salem is rested upon you when the rebellion and his ingratitude enslaved you, dragging you into this hostile valley. Here you were hurt and humiliated, becoming an instrument of impiety in the hands of the tyrant. I, however, redeemed you with my blood. Now our wounds will be restored, and soon we will be enthroned amidst the praises of a victorious Salem. When this dream comes true, we will witness together the end of those who rose against us to hurt us. Samael and his followers will be devoured by the fire that will reduce Sodom and Gomorrah to ashes." Concluding his solemn oath, the young prince, already hidden by the darkness of the night, left that hill, and on it the marks of his suffering. Since the king's son had left, promising to return with the scepter, Salem lived moments of unspeakable anxiety. In tears, the king and the remaining subjects remembered all the happy past broken by the ingratitude of the rebels. What tortured them most was the absence of the prince and the scepter, without which all the brightness of that kingdom of peace would be obfuscated. Desiring to comfort the hearts of his subjects, Melchizedek advanced in the middle of the night toward the mountains that surrounded Salem. Still weakened and injured, he continued on his upward march, hoping to reach his homeland in the morning. That long dark night was finally overcome by the rays of dawn. In Salem, the hope of seeing Melchizedek again with his scepter was almost abandoned when, looking at the Mount of Olives, they saw him descending down the road from Gethsemane. When they found him in the deep valley of Sidron, they were frightened in his appearance. His face was pale and his mantle soaked in blood. Precisely still, he smiled, expressing great joy. When they asked him about the reason for those blood marks, Melchizedek took out his wounded hands from under his mantle, showing them in the midst the redeemed scepter. After telling them the steps that led him to the rescue of the scepter, the muted subjects bowed reverently at his feet, acclaiming him as their Redeemer and King. In the midst of the praises of the redeemed host, the prince was introduced into the royal palace, where under the care of his loving father he should recover from his suffering. The disfigured scepter, now more precious, would also be restored, having to become even more beautiful than before. The coronation day was set for the next Yom Kippur. On that day, Melchizedek would seal with the restored scepter the triumph over all the faithful, as well as the condemnation of the rebels.